fiscal cliff. Will they bring it up in the House? Will they amend it? Will they approve what the Senate did? Those are all the questions that remain here this afternoon as our coverage continues here on C-SPAN. House Democrats are going to be meeting at 1:15, and Republicans at 1 p.m. A lot of questions will be asked then. Live coverage here on C-SPAN.
Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Would our guests in the gallery please join us? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed, with amendments, H.R. 8, cited as the Job Protection and Recession Prevention Act of 2012, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
Thank you.
The chair will entertain up to 15 requests for 1-minute speeches on either side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition? Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ukraine, once a model for democratic transition in Eurasia region and the world after the Orange Revolution, has been experiencing significant backsliding in democracy. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe found that the October elections did not meet international standards, and the arrest and continued harassment and mistreatment of opposition leaders, including the former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, also causes concern. The trial against Ms. Tymoshenko in the gas case was described as selective persecution in statements by the U.S., Russia, United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, Spain, and other European countries. On July 16, 2012, our colleague Chris Smith introduced a measure calling for Ukrainian authorities to release political opposition leaders and hold free and fair elections. At the beginning of a new year, I call on Ukrainian officials to immediately free Mrs. Tymoshenko and other political prisoners. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
New Year, Mr. Speaker. I request permission to address the House for 1 minute. Unanimous consent to reside in the Senate.
Without objection, the gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
A New Year's deal for New Year's Day. Or is it Groundhog Day? Because like the movie Groundhog Day, this government in 2 months will arrive at another crisis of debt, of spending and taxes. Our debt-based economic system, with its exponential growth of debt due to compounded interest, consigns us to massive unemployment, threats to the social safety net, a deteriorated infrastructure, a psychology of poverty amidst plenty, austerity. Congress must regain its full power accorded under the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, to coin, to create money, to invest in our nation interest-free, to put America back to work. Why go into debt, borrowing money from China, Japan, South Korea, when we have the constitutional authority to protect our economic sovereignty and to assure America's long-term fiscal health? The endless cycle of increasing taxes and cutting spending will not work, because the debt keeps ballooning with compounded interest. It's time for a new American monetary policy to climb out of poverty and debt. Reforms are outlined in the National Emergency Employment Defense Act, H.R. 2990. It's the NEED Act. Let's regain control of America's destiny.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it's New Year's Day, 2013. What an excellent time for Congress to make at least one New Year's resolution. Congress is addicted to spending money. Maybe Congress should join Spending Anonymous. Here's the 12-step plan. 1, Congress should admit it is addicted to spending someone else's money. 2, make a list of the wasteful spending. 3, pass a yearly budget and a constitutional balanced budget amendment. 4, stop giving money to countries that hate us. 5, have the resolve not to spend money we don't have. 6, don't contribute to the addiction by taking more money away from Americans. 7, don't borrow any more money from China. 8, don't make excuses for our addiction. 9, don't blame others for the addiction. 10, run Congress like most people run their family budgets. 11, remember we are to do the will of the people. And 12, have a support group and meet regularly to confess our addiction. Mr. Speaker, Congress should join Spending Anonymous. And that's just the way it is.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. In the early 19th century, 4 million slaves resided in the South. Public opinion in the North began to oppose it. States resisted by seceding from the Union, and a brutal civil war ensued. In order to end slavery and the war, President Lincoln, on September 22, 1862, issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation directing all rebelling states to free their slaves and return to the Union in 100 days. Lincoln made it clear, should they fail to do so, he would use his authority as Commander-in-Chief to end slavery. States failed to act. Lincoln signed the proclamation January 1, 1863. More than 200,000 lives were lost in the war. Lincoln lost his own life with an assassin's bullet following re-election. This is American history that every individual must understand and appreciate. Today, Mr. Speaker, we commemorate 150 years of freedom for African-American citizens. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the House passed a fiscal cliff bill this morning without time for senators to adequately consider it. And more importantly, without giving the American people time to understand it and share their insight with Congress. Senator Mitch McConnell observed, quote, "This shouldn't be the model for how we do things around here," end quote, and then the Senate proceeded like a bull in a china closet anyway. The Senate boasts it is America's deliberative body. Today, that claim rings hollow. Mr. Speaker, the House must postpone this vote until Congress and the American people have time to study and evaluate this extraordinarily complex legislation and its impact on taxes, revenue, the economy, our debt, and a myriad of other issues. It is better to get it right than to act in haste. Mr. Speaker, if we vote on the Senate fiscal cliff bill today, I will vote against it because this is not the way to do the people's business. I will not condone with my vote a process that denies the American people an opportunity to participate in their republic on issues of this magnitude. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
The agreement we are expected to vote on, perhaps as early as this afternoon, has many commendable and important items. Unfortunately, too many are short-term, much is left out, and most important, we are losing an opportunity for reform. We cannot continue to have, by far, the world's largest and most expensive military, the world's lowest taxes, the most expensive and inefficient health care system, and continue to allow our country's infrastructure to fall apart, all while America grows and ages. This agreement represents absolutely the least we could have done under these circumstances and tragically institutionalizes for the next Congress the madness of short-term frenzy around artificial deadlines that drives the American public crazy. Not only can we do better, we must do better. This flawed, partial plan is not just a lost opportunity. It represents a real setback.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition? Does the gentleman ask for unanimous consent? Yes. Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this is the last time I'll have the opportunity to address my colleagues winding up a 20-year career in the House of Representatives on January 3rd. And I want to thank my constituents for giving me the honor and the opportunity to fulfill the dreams of a 10-year-old child who dreamed about becoming a member of the House of Representatives. 20 years ago, almost to the date when I was first sworn in, our family visited the Emancipation Proclamation at Archives. It's open again today. He was from my state. He served our state. And in the incredible speech that he gave at Gettysburg, he talked about people coming here to do the unfinished work. That's the job of all of us as members of Congress, is to do the unfinished work, as Lincoln saw it. Unfinished work not only to bind the wounds of the nation, but to keep America together. And that's the charge that we have continually, is to keep America together. God bless you, and thank you for the opportunity to serve.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the people in this chamber that do all the complaining about spending, the record clearly shows, voted for all the spending that they complain about. 2 wars that took $1 trillion out of the American economy, unfunded tax cuts that created the worst economy in 60 years, and an unpaid drug prescription program that costs $730 billion over the next 10 years. Moreover, the House Republican budget for 2013 spends $800 billion more than it takes in revenues. That Republican budget imbalance will require raising the debt ceiling early this year. And raising the debt ceiling does not authorize you to spend more money. It authorizes you to pay back the money that you've already spent. Republicans in this House voted for and have a moral obligation to repay that money. Mr. Speaker, the American economy needs to grow much more than the projected 2% for 2013. 2% growth is not enough to sustain the current level of employment. The American economy needs robust growth at 3 to 4%, growth that can only come from investments in education, road and bridge building, research. We need to do nation building, not in Afghanistan, not in Iraq, but nation building at home here in America. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank the Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what do we know with certainty about the bill which passed the Senate? We know it has bipartisan support. That's encouraging. I'm a Republican who's been making the case that revenues must rise. That bill does that, and if it becomes law, it provides some certainty to our tax code, which would surely help our economy. Yet, Mr. Speaker, we also know with certainty that it fails to address the mortal threat facing our country, uncontrolled spending. It fails to reflect the balanced approach that was advocated by our President. So we find ourselves again with a bill that reflects not financial wisdom, but the seductive spirit that pervades this town. The time to confront our spending addiction is not now, it's later, they say. We'll do the right thing then. Lacking knowledge, political courage, or both, leaders in Washington continue to overpromise. They're like salespeople who tell their customer they can have the $30,000 car but only pay $18,000 for it. Who doesn't like that deal? But the truth, Mr. Speaker, what we know with certainty is that the full cost indeed will be paid by their children, the next generation of Americans. There's a better way forward, Mr. Speaker. We're Americans. Let's find it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition? Does the gentleman ask for unanimous consent?
I do indeed.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard from a colleague of mine on the Democratic side who sounds like he's not going to vote for this provision, and we've heard it from a couple folks on the other side. Well, I'm going to vote for it, not because I think it's all the best sugar and spice and everything nice, but because, for one thing, I believe our President and our Vice President know what they can get in a negotiated deal with the Republican side in the Senate and what might pass this House as well. And they know what our country needs. And my district can't afford to wait a few days and have the stock market go down 300 points tomorrow if we don't get together and do something. And people in my district need unemployment compensation. They need to know in the future they're going to have that low-income earned credit, tax credit, and a college credit. It's important that we keep this country moving in the right direction and away from another recession. E pluribus unum is not just on our bills, but it's what we are as legislators. We're one of 435, one of 535, including the Senate. We need to come together and work together for the betterment of the country. This isn't the perfect deal, but it's the deal we got, and it's a deal I'm going to support, and I hope that my colleagues will resolve to give the President and the Vice President the benefit of the doubt as the year goes on, as I do today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Ask to address unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, last night was the first time in my life that I've sat at my desk as we went into a new year, but it gave me a chance to contemplate what we're about. We're going into a new year as the first generation who did not ask the question, what can we do, what can we sacrifice to make future generations have a better life than we have? Instead, we ask, how much can we eke up taxes a little bit so that we can keep spending 58 cents to get a dollar's worth of wasteful, bloated government, so that our children and grandchildren can pay 42 cents of every dollar that we waste on ourselves? Is that any way to start the new year? We're taking up a bill that will not do anything to cut spending. I'm embarrassed for this generation. The future generations deserve better. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
I seek the opportunity to address the House for 1 minute.
Does the gentleman ask for unanimous consent?
I do.
Without objection, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, it's a new year. And for my youngest children, each will grow 1 year older this year. My daughter Chandler will turn 10, and my teenager Cameron, she will turn 15. Today we know the birthday of the Emancipation Proclamation as we celebrate it here in Washington. Our country hopefully gains maturity as we go forward. We were reminded a long time ago that a house divided would not stand. We have to come together, and we should put away some of the nonsense. To attack the President for spending when our founders, when writing the Constitution, gave the Congress the control over spending. In Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, we control spending. So if we want to back away from spending, we need to look in the mirror. But in terms of this agreement, rather than curse the darkness, we should look at those who have lit the candle. When we can have a bipartisan vote of 89 senators, start this year off, move our country forward, we should rally behind it. I ask my colleagues to vote in favor of the agreement to move away from the cliff and continue to move our country towards greatness. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise the expense.
Without objection, the gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish I could say that this was a proud moment, a moment in which we started the year off right, in which the 1st of January was the first of a great many good things. It isn't. We're kicking the can down the road. And worse than that, when faced with a mountain of debt that we were heading for, like an airplane, did we climb over it? No. What we're going to do in the present plan is put nearly another $1 trillion worth of debt on the American people. Time is running out to change the direction, because that $1 trillion, it isn't just a problem for the next generation. It's a problem for corporate America. It's a problem for every American. The $1 trillion we spend and waste this year is $1 trillion that we will have to bear for the rest of our lives. Mr. Speaker, I may vote for what comes on the floor. I certainly will vote for a bill that I'm going to manage in a few minutes to hold down the growth of spending in the government. But I'll tell you, I won't do it thinking we've accomplished anything here today other than the smallest finger in a dike that, in fact, has hundreds of holes in it. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I join with my earlier colleague on acknowledging the 150th year of the Emancipation Proclamation. What a moving moment last evening at the National Archives when I read the words, "Henceforth these slaves are freed." I rise with a more optimistic view, and a view that says that we have the opportunity to do what is right by the American people. But we must also recognize that we have to tell the truth. At the end of the Clinton administration, this nation had $5 trillion in surplus. But with wasteful tax cuts and spending by our Republican friends, we find ourselves in this deficit. I don't know what my decision will be as we move forward on this issue of the fiscal cliff, but I will say this. We will not tolerate the American people being held hostage over the debt ceiling and these unhelpful cuts that will cut into those who are the most vulnerable. That will not be the pathway that we will take. For every economist will tell you that if you invest in your people and build infrastructure, you'll grow this country, and you'll churn this economy, and you'll be able to get people jobs. That's the message that will come forth from this day, January 1st, when we are here in this Congress. I want the American people to be optimistic because they're members of Congress that will fight for your growth, your opportunity, your freedom. That is what America is all about. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the deal that Republican Senate leader Mitch McConnell was able to get his colleagues to pass last night is a bad deal for America and a worse deal for our children's future. It's the largest increase in public debt that this body will have ever passed, more than $5 trillion from today's current law. Our deficit this year alone is likely to be about $1.3 trillion. This would reduce it down to $1.24 trillion with the $60 billion of new revenue that it gains. Most importantly, it sets up 3 more fiscal cliffs over the next 3 months. When appropriation spending expires on March 27th, when the debt ceiling has to be increased at the end of February, and when the sequester has to be dealt with at the very same time. So all we've done is to stumble forward into an even less predictable situation with far fewer resources to invest in our nation and our children's future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
Permission to speak to the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't particularly like the bill that's going to come to the floor. I'm going to vote for it. And the reason is that I, stumbling through one of those dollar general stores or whatever, trying to look at for some last-minute gifts, and I stumbled across this section that had Gorilla Glue and Magic Stickum glue or whatever, and I thought, boy, if I can get some of this stuff, first I'd glue the top of the kitchen trash can so that my wife's puppy won't continue to go in it. And then I thought, well, I'll use some of this glue to impress people that I could actually fix things. And I thought, you know, maybe I could do it when I'm performing marriages instead of saying, you know, until death do us part, until the glue wears out. And then I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could glue ourselves to each other across the aisles? I mean, after all, it is only if we are sticking together that we're going to be able to address the problems that face this country. And the truth of the matter is, we already have some glue. One nation under God, patriotic glue. We're supposed to work together, to stick together. Without us coming to the point where we really understand e pluribus unum, out of many one, this body, for the lack of glue, will not do the business of this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, last night the Senate did what great deliberative bodies are supposed to do. They worked together. They compromised. They accommodated other points of view, and they got the job done. And yes, it was a little bit late. It wasn't exactly as timed as we would have liked. But now it's our turn. The Senate passed it in a bipartisan, overwhelming way. My colleagues, let's join together today. Let's show the American people that this Congress is not broken, that we are not so dysfunctional, that we can't, at minimum, work together, come to agreement, compromise. Let's get this done. This is too important for the American people to let this go one more day. Please join me in supporting the fiscal cliff bill today. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're about to have a hold-your-nose vote here in the House of Representatives. And many of us are going to wrestle with the problem of making perfect be the enemy of the good. We do have an opportunity to stabilize taxation for 99% of all of Americans, to extend depreciation and investment expansion for small businesses, to make sure that families in America, through the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and student loans are stabilized for their planning in the calendar year 2013. The R&D tax credit is extended. So there's a lot in this package that's good. There's a lot in this package, or I should say there's a lot that's not addressed at all in this package. We have a debt ceiling crisis pending. We have a sequestration crisis pending. It must be addressed, or it's going to have a huge drag on the United States economy, and in the case of the debt, once again, revisit the issue of default for the first time in American history. So it's not a perfect package, but it is something that gets us by while we tackle the larger issues in the next Congress. I pray God that next Congress is more willing to compromise than this. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Today, we have an option. We are confronted with a bill that we can vote for or vote against. We can allow us to go over the ceiling, or we can try to come together and pass something that probably on both sides of the aisle no one agrees with 100% of. It seems to me that while I have long advocated for a big deal so that we don't have to continue fighting in regards to the debt ceiling or sequestration, that we've got to make sure, though, that we do something. And this bill that we will come to the floor today, I will vote for, with many a thing in the bill that I don't like, but I'm sure from listening to some of my colleagues, there's many things in that bill that they don't like. And generally what I find and what I've come when both sides don't like something, then maybe we are moving in the right direction and maybe we're moving forward in a positive way for the American people. So I come to the floor saying I'm not fully satisfied, but it's all right, because I think that we've got to move forward and do the best that we can for the American people. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's table the bill H.R. 1464 with the Senate amendments thereto and concur in the Senate amendments.
The clerk will report the title of the bill and Senate amendments.
H.R. 1464, an act to develop a strategy for assisting stateless children from North Korea and for other purposes. Senate amendments.
Without objection, the reading is disposed with. Is there objection to the original request of the gentleman or the gentlelady from Florida? Without objection, the Senate amendments are agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Without objection, the title is amended.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentlelady from Florida.
I send to the desk a privileged concurrent resolution and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 147, resolved that pursuant to the last sentence of Section 106 of Title I, United States Code, the requirement of Section 107 of such title that the enrollment of any bill or joint resolution be printed on parchment is waived for the duration of the 112th Congress, and the enrollment of any such bill or joint resolution shall be in such form as may be certified by the Clerk of the House of Representatives or the Secretary of the Senate as applicable to be truly enrolled bill or joint resolution as the case may be.
Without objection, the concurrent resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Recorded votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 6726.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 6726, a bill to prevent the 2013 pay adjustment for members of Congress and persons holding other offices or positions in the federal government from being made.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Speaker, I recognize myself for such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, for the last 2 years, oversight has worked diligently. Our professionals have worked to a certain extent against their own best interest. They've found excesses in pay and compensation within the federal system and moved with careful detail to try to reduce those amounts, make them more commensurate with the private sector. Currently, federal workers receive typically over $100,000 and are about 16% higher compensated than their private sector counterparts. Today we will consider something on the fiscal cliff, but before we do it, I felt it was important to deal first with this bill, and so I'm happy to in a few moments to recognize Mr. Fitzpatrick, the author of this bill, which is very narrow but simply says that the President cannot and should not add about $11 billion to the deficit by the stroke of a pen, by an executive order, at a time in which he's negotiating to try to raise taxes to earn maybe another 60 or 70 billion at most for the federal treasury. So this will stop the federal workers from receiving a pay increase. It will not stop their step increases. It will not stop their merit increases. It will not stop a great many other increases in their pay and compensation. But it will say that at this time, when the American people are not getting automatic cost of living increases, neither should the federal workforce, and oh, by the way, Mr. Speaker, neither should you, neither should the ranking member, neither should I. And this bill stops us from giving ourselves a pay increase that the President has asked for, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, in order to allow the author of the bill to speak, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California. Gentleman from California.
I yield the gentleman such time as he may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, the American people do not get an automatic pay increase, and neither should members of Congress. My bill, the Congressional Pay Freeze and Fiscal Responsibility Act, gives us the chance to show the American people that, at least in this regard, that we do get it. Freeze salaries now, including for members of Congress at current levels. Mr. Speaker, there are too few opportunities in this town where issues can bring us together. The President has done that for us this week. Unbelievably, in the middle of talks this week on tax rates and sequestration revision, in the midst of high deficits and a growing national debt, the President has proposed pay increases for members of Congress and has done so by executive order dated December 28th. I have to say that nobody in this town saw this coming, and very few think it is warranted. The Congress has not produced a budget in 3 years because the Senate refuses to do their job. The last thing they need is a pay increase. In fact, the No Budget, No Pay Act should be the law of this land. If you don't produce a budget within the prescribed period of time, you should not get paid. And if you produce a budget after the prescribed period of time, you should not get paid retroactively. Mr. Speaker, this is common sense. But common sense just isn't too common in this city. And there's no sense at all in the President's executive order to increase pay at this time. Not now, not under these circumstances, and not in this economy. It is an action taken unilaterally by the President, which has earned an immediate and almost universal scorn, as well it should. As we close out 2012, there are still too many issues unresolved. There are too few instances of accomplishment or results. Our economy is still at risk, and the American people are still struggling. American workers have given all they can. Have we? Have we given all that we can? I'm glad to see that so many in this chamber have co-sponsored this measure, and in the past 24 hours, I've seen comments from Democrats and Republicans expressing outrage at the President's unilateral executive order. A Democrat in the Senate called it the worst idea ever. A Democrat in this House has called it inappropriate. So extend the pay freeze for all federal workers, including elected officials. This bipartisan policy was originally put in place by our Democrat colleagues because they recognized that the pain being felt across our economy could not be reserved for the private sector. Federal workers in my district and across the country are hardworking individuals. They deserve fair compensation too. Mr. Speaker, we're not trying to punish or force unnecessary hardship on civil servants, but taxpayers should not be taking home less than federal workers. Recent studies have shown that the average federal worker earns 20% more than a private worker in a similar position. This disparity is even wider when benefits are taken into account. We have to recognize that over recent years there's been a growing disparity between the compensation for federal workers and their counterparts in the private sector. And quite frankly, that sends exactly the wrong message at exactly the wrong time. The President's own debt commission, which has thus far been ignored by the President, recommended a 3-year pay freeze for federal government workers. If it would have been adopted at that time, that pay freeze would have lasted through 2013, the same period of time that this bill proposes. Of course, we all agree that the men and women of our nation's military deserve a pay increase while our nation is at war. This bill provides that members of the armed forces will continue to be eligible for the pay increases that have been supported by me and a strong bipartisan majority of my colleagues. Mr. Speaker, we hear a lot of talk from some of our colleagues about shared sacrifice. Higher taxes from Obamacare are coming, and tax rates for certain businesses and individuals are going to go up. The private sector and small businesses are being asked to sacrifice. What kind of a message does it send if at the same time members of Congress, the administration, and the federal government get a pay raise? That is exactly the wrong message at exactly the wrong time. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and to send the American people the strong message that the public sector and elected officials do not consider themselves exempt from the economic realities of our time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this bill, H.R. 6726, which seeks to extend the pay freeze on the dedicated men and women of our civil service for the 3rd consecutive year. This is a pig in a poke. From the outset, let me be clear. I strongly support freezing the salaries of members of Congress. I've signed a letter to do that, and if this bill did only that, I'd be an original co-sponsor. But it doesn't. The Senate last night did just that. It froze our salaries. But it didn't do this. It didn't extend that freeze for a 3rd year to the men and women who serve our country in federal service. The bill before us today cynically pairs a pay freeze for us in Congress with a continuation of the pay freeze in career civil servants. It's yet another tired, duplicative, cheap shot at our nation's dedicated federal workforce. One last parting shot in the dying days of this Congress, which cannot die too soon. If members of Congress and the public simply take a look at the scoreboard, they'll see that with respect to the deficit reduction, federal workers not only have borne a disproportionate share of the cost, they've virtually borne the only share of the cost. Federal employees have contributed already $103 billion toward deficit reduction through an extended pay freeze that continues to this day, and benefit cuts. For example, federal workers contributed $60 billion toward deficit reduction as a result of the two-year pay freeze covering 2011 and 2012. The recent pay freeze extension through March of this year adds another $28 billion. This total also includes the $15 billion contribution that will be made by federal new hires, who, starting next year, will see their pay decrease by 2.3% as contributions to their pensions are raised compared to current civil service with no commensurate benefit increase. Meanwhile, this inequity is amplified when one compares the financial sacrifice made by our dedicated civil servants for deficit reduction. I might add, as if it weren't enough, my friends on the Republican side of the aisle actually tried for the first time to finance transit in America in a transportation bill that died an ignominious and well-deserved death. $50 billion by having the same pension benefit cuts on existing civil service, which would have added $50 billion more to the deficit reduction cost, only a portion to federal workers. Meanwhile, if I'm not mistaken, compared to the $103 billion deficit reduction contribution by federal employees, the deficit reduction sacrifices, that shared sacrifice my friend from Pennsylvania referred to, has demanded of millionaires and billionaires adds up to a grand total of zero. Yet despite these facts, there are still some attempting to squeeze even more deficit reduction out of federal workers, even as they seek to protect the millionaires and billionaires who have yet to make any contribution to debt reduction in this country. Republicans in the 112th Congress have treated federal employees like America's piggy bank, dipping into pay and benefits to help pay for everything, from the payroll tax cut to unemployment benefits to transit and the transportation bill. Federal employees are on the front line of communities throughout America. They defend America. They serve side by side with our military in theaters of war. They put out fires. They process Social Security checks. They deal with the sick, and they deal with our children. They protect our borders. I strongly oppose any attempt to cut benefits or wages that federal employees have earned by providing essential services to all Americans. Given the very small share of the federal budget represented by federal employee salaries, further reducing their pay and benefits is not rational, not an effective way to reduce our nation's debt. It's picking on them. I urge my colleagues to vote against this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I would trust that the gentleman was unaware that Mr. Fitzpatrick also does have a bill that only freezes our pay, and it does not bear the gentleman's name as a co-sponsor. Perhaps he could correct that today. And with that, I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the gentlelady, Ms. Bachmann.
Gentlelady is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from California. I thank Mr. Fitzpatrick for his bill as well. I, too, was shocked when I saw that the President of the United States, out of nowhere, at no request from any member of Congress, had issued a unilateral executive order, which means he decided to take the law into his own hands and, in effect, become his own Congress and decide unilaterally at the height of the fiscal cliff debate that he would throw a new wrench into that argument. And it would be this: when there is massive uncertainty, unfinished business, he would decide that he would unilaterally give a pay increase to the United States Congress exactly when the public is uncertain and doesn't know what's going to happen. Will their taxes go up? Will they no longer be the recipient of a spending program? And so now Congress is going to get a spending increase? This was a cynical, planned move, Mr. Speaker, on the part of our President. He brought great drama to this effort, unnecessary drama, because you see, this House of Representatives already did the job to avert the fiscal cliff. We did this work. It was completed last August. We said that no one's taxes need to go up, and we were able to offset any spending cuts. The work was done. The problem is the Senate never took up the completed work of the House, and the President of the United States spent the last half of this year continually castigating the House of Representatives for not having this work done when we did our work. And so out of nowhere, again, not at the request of Congress, the President decided to make a very unlovely party to this conversation, the Congress, even less palatable by putting upon us the idea that we wanted to raise our own salary when we had nothing whatsoever to do with that. That's why over the weekend I directed my staff that we would put forth a bill to take away this unilateral increase in salary for Congress at the President's hand. We put our bill together. Mr. Fitzpatrick put his bill together. We both introduced bills yesterday. And I'm very happy to be a part of this bill, as every member of Congress is happy to be for this bill, because after all, this had nothing to do with the conversation. This was a cynical effort on the part of the President. No, and I believe nothing more cynical than the fact that the current agreement with the fiscal cliff was agreed to, we're told, somewhere around 11:30 last night. The bill was voted on at 2 o'clock in the morning. Now again, this is New Year's Eve. I don't know how many senators between midnight and 2 a.m. in the morning had a chance to thoroughly read this agreement that's 157 pages long. You see, this is not how we should run our government. This is drama, unnecessary drama. And President Obama bears the responsibility for his failure to lead and his intentional effort, it appears, to mislead the American public with this cynical bill. That's why we are here this morning, to clarify the President's action. This was not at our behest, and we are rejecting this measure today to increase Congress's salary. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say I appreciate the gentlelady's point about cynicism, but federal workers and the American public might be forgiven for thinking that it is cynical to be decrying a last-minute deal necessitated by the fact that the House has been out for 15 of the last 19 weeks in recess instead of doing its business here on the House of the floor, which is why we're here today. By the way, I also want to appreciate, because I know it wasn't a cheap shot, I know that the distinguished chairman of the committee was simply trying to inform me of the fact that a bill I was not aware of was introduced yesterday. If there is a clean bill introduced by my friends from Minnesota and Pennsylvania simply to freeze congressional salaries, I'm only too happy to co-sponsor it. I know that will reassure my friend, the chairman of the committee. I now yield such time as he may consume to the distinguished ranking member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, Mr. Cummings from Maryland.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 6726, which would extend the pay freeze on federal employees through the end of 2013 and eliminate the pay adjustment for members of Congress. You know, I think we need to be very careful in this discussion. As my distinguished colleague from Virginia just stated, I don't think there's any member of Congress that is against freezing the pay of members of Congress. If I had known about the bill, I would have co-sponsored it. I don't know when it was filed, but I would have co-sponsored it. I'm sure, as he said, he would have also. But this is not. This is a different issue. And I cannot understand why the House is considering this bill right now. The Senate just approved a landmark deal to avert the fiscal cliff with widespread bipartisan support. It's a vote of 89-8. Acting on the fiscal cliff legislation as soon as possible should be our first and most urgent order of business this afternoon. But instead, this bill, which is yet another assault on very hard-working, middle-class American workers, was introduced not very long ago. Is this really the way the majority wants to begin the new year? Members of Congress certainly can do without a pay adjustment. And the bill passed by the Senate last night to resolve the fiscal cliff already includes a provision freezing members' pay. And I plan to vote for the package that came out of the Senate, assuming it stays in its present form. But federal workers are the backbone of our government. Let me say that again. Federal workers are the backbone of our government. They're the ones who support our troops in the battlefield. They are the ones who provide care to our veterans. They're the same ones that bring about cures for dreadful diseases at NIH. They are the ones that protect our borders and safeguard our food supply. They're the same ones that ensure our seniors get their Social Security checks and help hunt down terrorists like Osama bin Laden. They're the same ones. In return for their hard work and dedication, the majority has rewarded federal workers with an unprecedented assault on their compensation and on their benefits. This has included proposals to arbitrarily cut the number of federal workers, and all you got to do in my district, when you go and visit a place like Social Security and you talk to the employees, many of whom are my constituents, employee ranks are being decimated, and people are working harder and harder for without the help that they need. These provisions have gone on to slash, our colleagues have gone on to slash the retirement benefits, and now with the most recent proposal to extend the current 2-year pay freeze for yet another year. And I know all kinds of studies are presented to say that federal workers are making a whole lot of money. Well, maybe we need to walk around and do a little survey of our own and talk to the people who work around here. Go to some of these departments, agriculture, the various agencies, and talk to them. And talk to some of the ladies who may be single mother household, making $45,000 a year. Talk to her about a pay freeze. Talk to the gentlemen who moved our offices. We've seen them all in the House throughout our buildings. Ask them about the pay freeze. Talk to them. And I think they'll tell you another story. Millions of middle-class federal workers have already sacrificed more than $100 million in the name of deficit reduction and to pay for the extension of unemployment benefits to millions of other workers. Yet our House Republicans insist on raiding their pay and their benefits again. Enough is enough. We need to put aside this legislation and take up the fiscal cliff legislation immediately. The Senate has done its work, and now it is our responsibility. The one thing we should not do is to let the markets open tomorrow without the fiscal cliff being resolved. And as I listen to my good friend Mr. Fitzpatrick talk about this provision with regard to making sure that members of Congress and not get a pay increase, and I agree with him totally. I hope that he will also join me when I vote for the legislation that has been sent over here by the Senate, since it contains that very, very important provision. And with that, I wanted to thank again the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, the ranking member made a good point, and in this body you should always go along with that which is true and oppose that which is false. The gentleman made an excellent point. We do have hundreds of thousands of hardworking federal employees. They deliver to the American people a good product. The vast majority of them, if you ask them, do not feel they're overcompensated. They've worked hard, they're highly educated, and in fact, they're not overpaid in many ways. They do, in fact, have a very generous defined benefits plan, something the American people usually don't have, something that would guarantee them a pension over and above their 401k, and automatically it increases with inflation. Automatically it is funded. That's true whether you're a postal worker, a member of this body, or the executive branch. We're not arguing whether or not the federal worker is dedicated at all. We're arguing whether this is the right time to add $11 billion to a $10 trillion deficit that we're not dealing with. We have a $10 trillion deficit after today's action on, quote, ending the cliff that is still going to be projected. It hasn't been scored exactly, but it will still be over $1 trillion this year, and if history repeats itself for every remaining year of the Obama administration. Now, the gentleman from Maryland did say one thing that perhaps was not accurate, and he didn't mean to. He said, well, if you ask people around here, well, perhaps he forgot that here in the House of Representatives, this entire body, except for congressional salaries, which are stipulated under the Constitution, we have in fact had to deal with a 5% reduction year over year in actual money available to run the House, and then the next year 6.4%, meaning we have dropped more than 11% in the dollars spent, not in some hypothetical base plus, but in the dollars spent, we have dropped more than 11% under Speaker Boehner. That kind of a cut has not been duplicated by the executive branch. Had it been duplicated by the postal workers, we wouldn't have a $12 billion loss there. Had it been duplicated by the executive branch, to be honest, Mr. Speaker, we would be talking today about how can we cut any more, and both sides would be agreeing. We haven't made an 11% drop in actual spending in 2 years. Had we done that, we wouldn't be looking at 100% growth in the last 12 years in the cost of government. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia.
How much time remains on this side?
Gentleman from Virginia has 9.5 minutes. The gentleman from California has 6 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I would simply observe that my friend, the chairman of the committee, in talking about the 11% cut here in the House of Representatives, of course, that does not address the lack of productivity here in the House. There are many Americans who might think that that cut is deserved, given how little got accomplished in the 112th Congress, one of the least productive Congresses in American history. Mr. Chairman, I would normally yield, but I would remind my friend, Mr. Speaker, that he would not yield to me when he made his comments about co-sponsorship of the piece of legislation, and so I reluctantly will not yield. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 3 minutes.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this so-called federal worker pay freeze. As the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Federal Workforce, we have witnessed a deliberate effort over the past 2 years of the Republican majority to undertake a series of legislative attacks on our middle-income federal workers. And this bill is no different. Despite the title of this legislation, this bill would extend the current statutory pay freeze for all federal civilian employees, the vast majority of whom are middle-class earners through 2013. In place of a balanced approach to deficit reduction based on a genuine commitment to shared sacrifice, this bill again seeks to target federal employees who are already in the second year of a 2.5-year pay freeze. Collectively, because of the pay freeze that's been in effect for the last couple of years, these same federal workers have already contributed over $100 billion towards deficit reduction and continued unemployment benefits for other workers. I'd like to note that I am not opposed to a pay freeze for members of Congress. I think we should lead by example. In fact, I have voted for pay freezes for congressional pay on 6 different occasions. Regrettably, however, this legislation continues the concerning trend throughout the 112th Congress of attempting to address deficit reduction on the backs of middle-income workers in the federal government, again by attacking their take-home pay. These are the dedicated folks who work at our VA hospitals. They protect our borders. They care for, again, our wounded veterans. They run the research facilities in researching cures for deadly disease, and they provide services to the Defense Department, the State Department. So these are the people that are doing the hard work, and this is not a way to repay them. Again, they are already in the second year of a 2.5-year pay freeze. I agree that pay freeze should apply to me and other members of Congress. However, these these hard-working federal employees should not be asked to carry even more of this burden. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I know my friend from Virginia means well, but once again, he talks about a lack of accomplishment. Apparently, he hasn't looked at the work that the clerks have done here on the floor. He hasn't looked at the work that CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, has done, or the General Accountability Office. Those are all funded, and yet we had an 11% reduction in spending. So, in fact, when we talk about the hard-working men and women of the government, this branch has found a way to reduce spending by over 11% in spite of the hard-working men, not just here on the floor and in our offices, but the General Accountability Office and the CBO and others. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Virginia.